Eisenhower and his predecessors seldom, if ever, appeared in public with anyone in uniform. And when the various chiefs of staff of the Army or the Navy came over to testify in front of the Hill, either the Senate or the House, they wore civilian clothes because it was made very clear, don't wear your uniform and try to intimidate members. Wear civilian clothes and speak to them as American citizens. All of that went away in the 1960s. Mm-hmm. And since the 1960s, officers have been appointed to very high levels for the purpose of strengthening the political hands of the various administrations that have held power in the White House. In other words, if you stand next to a four-star and say, well, I'm here with General so-and-so, and you see all of these decorations, even though 90% of them are meaningless, the assumption is, oh, he must be right, or he wouldn't have this general with him. The general is backing him up. And of course, people were eager to be used as props for politicians that helped their careers, that got them appointed. You know, Milley was a wonderful example of that. Mm-hmm. And so is his successor. So were most of his predecessors. They were people that were user-friendly to whomever was in political power. Mm-hmm. So that's an enormous problem. So when you say, as a former professional soldier, how do I feel? Well, I see Tucker as a voice for freedom of speech, as someone who is a voice in the wilderness right now in the media in the United States, and for that matter, in the West. Mm-hmm. I've read a number of German reports that are just over the top. They make no sense at all, describing Tucker Carlson as some sort of Putin agent. They don't realize the numbers of people in their governments that are bought and paid for by people like Soros and others. Mm-hmm. Tucker isn't bought and paid for by anybody, and neither am I. And I'm happy to list my sources of income and compare those with the retired generals that they bring onto the mainstream media. And gosh, you're going to be surprised where their money comes from. So suddenly their message is very predictable. So no, I think it was a wonderful exercise in freedom of speech. And I would say that 90% of what President Putin said, I agreed with completely. It was accurate. It was not an attempt to fabricate anything. Where he fell apart, in my judgment, was his discussion of the outbreak of the Second World War. Mm-hmm. That was unfortunate. I wish he'd have left that out completely, because that was a blemish on an otherwise excellent discussion.
Interesting was that President Putin was somehow, that was my impression, trying to convince the West that first, he's not this crazy invader who wants to conquer the world, but that this is a conflict with the Ukraine, which has very old roots, ancient roots almost, and that he's still focused on negotiating. That was for me the essence of this interview. What is it for you? What was the most interesting thing you took out from that conversation?
No, I think you're right. As I said, what he said was truthful. The amazing part to me is that he continues to hold out hope that there will be a negotiating partner. And I would have thought that after his experience in 2022, when Boris Johnson showed up and destroyed the agreement that both sides had reached, it would have been clear to him that he wasn't going to have a negotiating partner. Mm-hmm. The second part is, I'm surprised that he is still open to doing business with us in any form, because we have lied to him repeatedly for years, and his predecessors. Now, here's something your viewers need to understand. Mr. Putin has always been known as friendly to the West, and he's probably, as a Russian senior leader, an individual who understands more about the West and appreciates it, particularly because of his years in Germany, than almost anyone else in the Russian political elite. And I would be very concerned about what happens at some point when President Putin is no longer in charge, because others around him and many, many others who aspire to be in his place are very hostile to the West in ways that should frighten everyone. So no, I agree with you. I think he did a wonderful job on that score. But of course, it doesn't make any difference what he says, because the media is in the hands of his opponents and frankly, our opponents, the people that are oppressing us, who are keeping the borders open, who are rewarding millions of people for coming to the country, passing out cash, phones, plane tickets, bus tickets, whatever they can get, and dumping them inside our country, much as you experienced after 2015, thanks to Mrs. Merkel and others. This is what faces us. And it's going to, I think it's going to blow up in everyone's face. but it probably won't blow up dramatically until the downturn in the economy really, really hits home.
I mean,
because we can't afford them.
What is interesting in the reactions we had in Germany and in Switzerland, a lot of people pushed this interview aside, saying, well, Putin, he can say what he wants. He's this crazy dictator, he's this aggressor, he's this ruthless autocrat. And just 1 week after this interview, we have the incident in this Siberian camp where Alexei Navalny died. I mean, it's very hard to say what the reasons, what the circumstances are. We have heard voices now from the Ukraine. The spy chief Budanov said, "Well, I have to disappoint you. Navalny died of natural circumstances." It's very hard to say, but here in the West, in Europe, in Switzerland, people say, why do you listen to Putin? He's a killer. Look at Navalny. Look what he does to the opposition. What would you counter to these concerned voices who think Putin is this maniac, this killer on the throne in the Kremlin?
Well, even a broken clock is right twice a day, and Budanov, too, can occasionally tell the truth. I think he's telling the truth. We shouldn't be surprised by that. He's been through some very tough times. He's been through extensive surgeries. His health hasn't been good. So that's not impossible. I know that he was under consideration for some sort of trade with the West and the United States of key
Navalny.
Yes. And it appears, and this is certainly substantiated by, I think, his wife's presence at the Munich Security Conference, he was always seen as the future Zelensky of Russia, as the man who would take over and sell his country out to the West. And I think MI6 and CIA both viewed him in those terms. I can't prove that because I'm not on the inside, but that's what reliable sources tell me. But again, it doesn't make any difference because the media in the West is going to say what it says. The difference between, incidentally, you and us is that we have alternative media. I don't know how much alternative media you've actually got anymore. I mean, the stuff coming to me from Germany is absurd. I mean, the descriptions, completely fatuous nonsense. I don't know what to say. But we do have alternative sources of media, although there's an ongoing effort, obviously, to suppress it. And this is a sort of idea of theory of complicity, that anyone who doesn't conform automatically to the mainstream narrative is dangerous and disruptive, which means he's telling the truth. So I think Tucker told the truth to the extent that he could. I think the interview is a success. It had a big impact here, more so probably here than in Europe.
One has to stress the point that I haven't followed all your statements during this war, but when I heard you for the first time, I was always struck by your views and your predictions, which in my eyes seemed true. It came out as you predicted. And you were one of the very few voices, prominent voices, who said from the beginning that the Ukraine is fighting an unwinnable war. And in this fog of propaganda, which is foaming out of the media, I would like to ask you again now, looking at the current situation on the ground in the Ukraine, what are we seeing now? What is happening in the Ukraine at the moment in your eyes?
I think the Zelensky regime is falling apart. They're beginning to engage in mutual recrimination. The key people in the structure are attacking each other, blaming each other. The forces in the field, which have been crumbling slowly for many, many months, are now really falling apart very quickly. There is no appetite anywhere in Ukraine to send more men into action. There's great resistance to it. The secret police, the SBU, is rounding people up and shooting people, but it's not enough. At the same time, the population lives in mortal fear of the Zelensky regime. In fact, I spoke with someone who came back quite recently within the last couple of days who told me that the population in Ukraine is far more afraid of the SBU and the Zelensky regime than they are of the Russians. And they all would like this to end. But you're never going to hear that to the mainstream media. But I think that's where it is. Zelensky seems to be very busy trying to close deals, selling off as much of Ukraine as he can to various agricultural conglomerates and BlackRock, headed by Larry Fink and others. I don't think it's going to last much longer. What's amazing to me, again, is that the Russians have exercised so much patience. And at some point, I think their hand will be forced. Putin's hand will be forced. He's going to have to close up the distance to the river to be sure. They are going to retake Odessa. They will retake Kharkov. Those things are already in planning and execution in the case of Kharkov. They've got about 110, 120,000 troops moving towards Kharkov right now out of Kupiansk. They have 90 to 100,000 headed to Dnipro. We'll see those things happen. The question is, what do you do about this cancer in Kiev? If you're Putin, you've got to get rid of it. It would be nice if the Ukrainian military itself took things into hand and did something, but that hasn't happened. So at some point, their hand will be forced. Now, I know that the Russian General Staff is currently considering the mobilization of an additional 800,000 troops. Now, given that they're well over that number right now, what would they need an additional 800,000 troops to do? Well, if you get no agreement from the West, if no one will talk to you, if you cannot negotiate an end to this, you are compelled to march west. You will have to grudgingly cross the Dnieper River and hope that once you cross and start heading west, that people will take you seriously. I mean, the recent photographs and news about tactical nuclear weapons being moved further west inside Russia, that's not designed to frighten everybody per se, because they have no interest in using those things. It's a demonstration of resolve. And it's telling us that if you contemplate attacking us, we will deliver total war and you will not win. I mean, that's the message. We hold a very weak hand. There's a reason that Chancellor Scholz and his colleagues have all laughed off Mr. Macron and his ridiculous statement about sending European forces or NATO forces into Ukraine. We certainly won't. We just cut 24,000 spaces out of the Army. The U.S. Army is now 450,000. That's a smaller number than the number of Ukrainian soldiers killed in the war. And now that number is out. I'm told now it's over 500,000, approaching 530,000. But for years, for months, people kept saying, oh, no, that's not true. Now people are beginning to admit the truth. It's harder and harder to conceal these things. 500,000 plus have been wounded. You know, we're talking about a generation of Ukrainians whose lives have been destroyed. It's not going to last, but you would think if there were a shred of humanitarian interest in people in Ukraine, that Scholz and his colleagues would stand up and say enough is enough.
I mean, it is striking. When this war started, even the most renowned war correspondents wrote, this war, Russia will lose within several months. Their armed forces, totally outmoded, ancient. They're using tanks which are totally out of fashion. People were ridiculing the Russian armed forces, making fun of it. I mean, I remember colleagues of yours, or you would say, you know, professional soldiers, generals like General Petraeus, but others saying, well, in the February 2023, Mariupol will be reconquered, all these scenarios. What would you say after these 2 years now? What is your assessment of the Russian army from a military standpoint? How competent is Putin as a military leader, and how competent are these armed forces of Russia?
A successful military commander always knows the limitations of his force as well as its potential. Without understanding limitations, you can't hope to be successful, because you will demand either too much or too little of the force you command. He is someone who I think from the very beginning wanted a limited war, and he went in with very limited means, only to discover that those means were inadequate. He corrected that problem. And today, the Russian military is probably stronger, with higher morale, better discipline, better equipment, and better leaders at every level than it was in the 1980s. So I think it's probably the best of its kind, certainly in Eurasia, no question about it. And contrary to everybody's expectation, Mr. Putin has been strongly supported in what he's done. Of course, there's always a 15%, sometimes 20, that doesn't like what any government does. But over 80%, I would estimate 85, based upon what I heard just within the last couple of days, 85% of the Russian population, excuse me, strongly supports what he's done. And he's been he's very reminiscent. This is going to sound strange to some of your listeners. He reminds me of Field Marshal Montgomery, who commanded the 8th Army in North Africa. Remember, the 8th Army had been beaten to a pulp. Over a 250,000 men could not stand up to 34,000 Germans and 70,000 Italians. He understood he had a morale problem. He understood that he needed new training, new leadership. He needed new equipment. He took his time and he built a better force. And then once he launched the force was very successful all the way through to the end of the Second World War with a few minor exceptions. That's exactly what Mr. Putin and his generals have done. They built a very good force, but they never pushed it too far, too fast. They avoided unnecessary casualties, and they took advantage of this. We call it the revolution in military affairs, which very simply is the links between space-based surveillance, intelligence, reconnaissance, surveillance, and strike systems, from mortars all the way up to tactical ballistic missiles. And he's annihilated the Ukrainians, who played repeatedly into his hands and attacked the absolutely impregnable defensive forces that were built to cover the flank, so to say, of this force that was being built up. It's worked brilliantly. We still haven't figured it out. We don't understand it. We haven't learned it. And people like Petraeus and others gave the Ukrainians terrible advice, because they treated the Russian military establishment as some sort of backward World War II anachronism that could be defeated by a modernized World War II force. It's failed miserably. But again, they are on the winning side, these retired generals and politicians, because they're well subsidized. They're well paid for having said what they did. Remember, the truth doesn't matter. That's the sad part. It's the message. The narrative is what counts. And if you supply the narrative and you pay people to repurpose and repeat the narrative over and over and over again, then you eventually convince everybody it's true. And remember, most Americans were never interested in Eastern Europe. And so when you step forward and say, well, all of these retired generals were wrong, people look at you sort of with a blank stare. Really? Oh, they're generals, aren't they? I mean, this is pathetic. It's tragic. Same thing's true in Great Britain, where you have lots of blowhards who are senior officers over there predicted the same nonsense.
Will NATO accept a Ukrainian defeat? I mean, all these leaders have talked themselves so much into demonizing Putin as kind of a new Hitler, as this some kind of crazy Alexander the Great who wants to conquer the whole world. I mean, can NATO just let Ukraine drop and say, okay, we were wrong, sorry, you sort out your own things? Or do you expect that there will be some kind of counter reaction by the West? Is the West even capable of countering this? Has Putin now the control of the situation? What would you say?
That's a good question. And I'm not sure that I'm in a good position to answer it, frankly. As I said before, I know what Americans are interested in. I know where they're focused. I don't know precisely in Europe what most European populations think. I do know that in Scandinavia, Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, in the Germanic countries, there is still a willingness to march without much question in the direction that the government and the media tell them to move. It's disappointing. So I guess there are two possibilities. One is that we, after the fall elections, get some sort of change in direction, and that change in direction results in an American decision to essentially end our participation in this debacle. I don't expect anyone to stand up and say, we were wrong, we've done enormous damage. It'll be like Vietnam. Suddenly it vanishes from the airwaves. Our forces leave. They just pack it up and go away. It's what I keep trying to tell Europeans. We're a commercial power, but we're primarily an air and naval power. So when things don't go our way, we leave. That's the simple truth. That's one possibility. And then the Europeans say, oh, the Americans have abandoned this. They've left. Maybe it's time for us to do the same. That's one possibility. I don't think NATO will survive, friend. I'd be very surprised if it survives this whole crisis. Eventually, it'll go down. On the other hand, there's another disappointing possibility. And that is you end up you remember this film called Untergang. And at the end of the film, the man who was playing, Bruno Ganz, who was playing Hitler, says, goodbye, I'm going into my office now to shoot myself or something. And you have this women standing out there and say, Mein Führer, what about the endgültiger Krieg, endgültiger Sieg? And he looks at them like, what are you, an idiot? I guess, it took a lot of Germans time to figure out that Soviet forces were really on the outskirts of Berlin. They couldn't believe it. And I'd say that our media has done an excellent job of misleading everybody in Europe and to a lesser extent here, because as I say, we do have alternative sources and people aren't really interested in it.
And you still have a New York Times, which astonishingly brought out this report last Sunday, where they said there are 12 CIA secret bunkers, more or less at the Russian border, since 10 years. I mean, it's amazing that our newspapers didn't even quote the New York Times. And the New York Times had to say, well, Putin was not so wrong after all when he said that the Americans were really interfering, were really, on our outskirts in Ukraine. I mean, the Putin narrative was somehow confirmed by these reports. I mean, at least even the New York Times brings these kind of reports. This is a silver lining of some kind.
Well, what that really indicates, because we've been down this road before, where reports are leaked deliberately from the Intelligence Committee because the decision has been made to end everything, to basically begin the gradual retreat or withdrawal. We had similar experiences in the last year or so in Afghanistan. Now, we always knew that everything that was being said about Afghanistan was a lie. But again, it wasn't confirmed until near the end when it became clear, well, we're going to get out. And you have similar problems in the Middle East right now. We did that in Vietnam. It was only towards the end that you began to see the truth emerge. So I'm sure that the New York Times probably said, well, what do we lose by publishing this? Because it's probably going to happen anyway. They've leaked it. If we don't publish it, somebody else will. And we want to be able to say that we did tell the truth at some point. Because
you would say this is like a mental preparation for leaving, for giving it all up.
I think so.
Yeah,
I think so.
We always end on an optimistic note in these not so optimistic times. And I want to ask you as a final question. I have a theory, an optimistic theory, and I just will present it to you very shortly. And you have to counter it, or probably you find it's somehow corresponding to reality. I think it's a gut feeling. Probably it's wishful thinking. I don't know. I think that the Russian president, who has now the upper hand militarily, he wants to, as he said, demilitarize the Ukraine. He doesn't want NATO in his garden. He wants to create a buffer zone with some kind of militarily non-threatful, whatever kind of rest state of Ukraine. But then he will, from a position of relative strength, stretch out his hand to the West, because the Russians and the Chinese are not very easy bedfellows. And the alliance of China and Russia is not really an alternative from the Russian perspective to the Russian relationship with the West, because my gut feeling is the Russians think, and especially Putin, they are some kind of Europeans. They want to have the Western respect. They want to be respected by the West. So the good news is when Putin wins this war, he reaches his goals, then he has a position of relative strength, and then he will try to build a bridge again to the West. Is that realistic, or is this total wishful optimism?
Well, I think most of what you've said is accurate. And again, I go back to what I said earlier about Putin. Let's hope that Mr. Putin remains in office for the foreseeable future, because he's the one who does share your orientation towards the West, particularly towards Germany. He's someone who knows history, and he knows that the two world wars were anomalies. Those were exceptions in the history of the German and Russian-speaking peoples. The majority of Germans were always doing business with Russia and vice versa. The two benefited from each other. He sees it in those terms and would ultimately like to see that happen again. Having said that, he would like to have good relations with Poland. And he's made that very clear on numerous occasions. So that much, I think, is true. It's a mistake to attach too much significance to this Chinese thing in the sense that there's some problems there. China and Russia are perfectly made for each other. Why? Because Russia has all the resources, the abundance of minerals, you name it, and the agricultural products that China desperately needs. China needs oil. It needs coal. China consumes virtually all the coal that it mines for itself. It needs millions of tons more than that just to run its industries. It does not have vast natural gas pipelines all over the country, but it can distribute coal via trains and rail and road. There are a lot of things that the two need from each other, but that doesn't mean that there's hostility. Neither is interested in fighting the other. And remember that they both share similar views in terms of who is a future possible opponent. And that possible opponent is right now us, though I think that will diminish in the future because we're losing interest in this nonsense. There's no reason for us to be in Asia with military power. That's all nonsense. The Chinese are not an aggressive military power. So what do the Russians and Chinese share in terms of a view of the future? It's called Japan. Japan is a juggernaut. Japan is unlike any other country in Asia. Japan is a hugely powerful scientific industrial state with excellent armed forces that could overnight defeat anything sent against them. Now, the Japanese don't want a war either. Okay, let's not get confused. But if you're Russian and you're Chinese, you worry about us, but you say, well, the Americans, they may pull out anyway. They're not in Asia, but who's here to stay? Who do we worry about? That's Japan. There are a lot more reasons for the Russians and the Chinese to cooperate than to struggle with each other. So I wouldn't attach too much significance to that. But everything else you've said is true. And I don't think that's a new development in Russian history. And I hope that someone in Berlin wakes up, smells the coffee, and recognizes this is all nonsense. By the way, if you look at what happened with the Nord Stream 2 or Nord Stream 1, back in the 50s and the 60s, the United States went to great lengths to ensure that the EU did not buy natural gas and oil from Russia to the extent that we could. We obstructed it then. We've obstructed it again recently during this Russo-Ukrainian war. Why? Because at the time, it was the Cold War, and we were trying to isolate the Soviet Union, which represented an existential threat to us in the West. It was real. That's not true today. There's no reason for it. The Europeans need to wake up and figure that out. The Russians, by the way, if you were sitting in Moscow and you looked west and you look at what's going on in Germany, Sweden, France, my God, why would you want anything to do with managing those countries? Those societies are in trouble. Those countries are in turmoil. The Russians aren't interested in that. They want to ensure that their society survives and flourishes. So the whole business about Russian offensives aimed at the West is just nonsense. It's got to go away.
It's so interesting, so fascinating. I mean, I had so many associations when you were talking, or I was thinking of a very provocative question to end our discussion. And the provocative question would be, you can be put into prison probably in Germany for asking this, but the longer I look at it, and of course it's very difficult to make a final judgment on current events, but I just thought of a statement by the American director Oliver Stone, who said, in an interview with Die Weltwoche many years ago, 7 years ago probably, he said, we asked him, what do you think about President Putin? After he had this very...
And provide the weapons that needs to defend itself. That is all. That is all Ukraine is asking. They're not asking for American soldiers. In fact, there are no American soldiers in the war in Ukraine, and I'm determined to keep it that way.
So you're right. He did nod. Now, this is entirely up to him. If he puts on the floor of the House the Senate passed bill for $61 billion, we know it will pass. If he doesn't put it on the floor, it will die on the vine. There's no effective way to force him to put it on the floor. And you're right. He did nod. So, but I do want to ask you, and the president said this weirdly, there are no American soldiers of war who are in Ukraine. What does that mean? They're out of uniform?
I think it probably means there are no American soldiers organized into fighting formations currently on the ground in Ukraine. We have plenty of people from the United States military, primarily Army, but not exclusively, that are in a variety of different settings, helping and supporting the Ukrainians, whether it is sitting behind computers or advising them in the field or helping them to train up new troops, whatever. There are plenty of people over there. And we know that they can't operate most of the sophisticated equipment and weapon systems that are being given to them without American, and I would add British and other NATO officers and soldiers helping them. So that's a lie, but I'm sure technically he's talking in terms of fighting formations. And by the way, he's right on that. We're not going to send any fighting formations to Ukraine. And contrary to what our friend Macron has said and others in Europe, they're not going to send anything. We don't have anything to send. We have no developed infrastructure for logistics and sustainment. We have no effective command and control structure that can bring together a coalition and employ it effectively against the Russians. The Russians are prepared. They have all of those things and they're ready to fight. We aren't. That's all there is to say.
Sort of big picture in Europe. I'm glad you raised it, Colonel. The Russians surveilled and released a conversation amongst German generals talking about sending Taurus missiles to Ukraine, claiming that the Minister of Defense, Mr. Pistorius, was in on this with them. It caused Olaf Scholz, not known for having a backbone at all, the same Olaf Scholz that practically invited Joe Biden to attack and destroy the Nord Stream pipeline, to go on national television and say, don't worry, we're not going to send anybody. Then you have Macron, who 3 times in the past 8 days has mused aloud about sending troops. So big picture, is Europe in a state of panic? European leadership, whether they are gutless or just ignorant?
No, I think they are in a state of panic, but we're talking about the globalist elites that currently govern Western Europe.
Yes.
They are in a panic because they have followed us unquestioningly down the stairs into hell. They suddenly realize that we're not going to go any further. In fact, they see a lot of evidence that we're looking upwards for a way to get out of the hell that we created for ourselves. They know that. There's no future in Ukraine for us. Ukraine is never going to be a member of NATO. And no one is going to go to war with the Russians. You know, a friend of mine in the French army, and he says this repeatedly to me, the only thing the French army is prepared to do is go on safari in Northern Africa. Well, he's right. And the rest of the armies in Europe are boutique forces. They're all designed for everything other than a serious war against a potentially professional and competent adversary like the Russians. What happened with the Germans is very tragic because it suggests a number of different things. First of all, the level of professionalism in the German military has fallen off precipitously. And I don't know how this was acquired and leaked, but it shouldn't have been acquired at all. These kinds of conversations should not have been conducted on a communication system that could easily be hacked and monitored. Surely they know better than that. Then secondly, if you listen to the discussion, it's amateurish. It's almost high schoolish. There is no appreciation for the gravity of the situation. What happens if these Taurus missiles are given to the Ukrainians, which means put in the hands of probably US, German, British allied officers, soldiers, technicians, and then launched against targets in Russia acquired by the CIA and provided to the Ukrainians. Well, we risk a serious war because we're now attacking Russian territory, Russian cities, Russian infrastructure, Russian soldiers and civilians. You would think that someone would have said, wait a minute, this is not the sort of weapon system that we should be considering giving to anyone, lest similar systems be used against us. And I think it's very clear. You don't need to read between the lines. Putin has made it clear, you do these things, Berlin could be on the receiving end of similar weapons.
We have HIMARS, or the Ukrainians have HIMARS and Patriots on the ground. Haven't the Russians destroyed them? Don't the Russians know where they are?
Of course, and they've destroyed most of them. Now I'm told there's efforts to make Patriot missiles surface-to-surface missiles. So instead of being employed for the reason they were originally developed against incoming aerial targets, high-speed jet aircraft at high altitude, or cruise missiles potentially, they're going to be used as surface-to-surface missiles. That's a new one. I hadn't expected that. That simply makes it that much more dangerous. But the Russians can find these things and they can destroy them, and that's what they'll do. But my point is, the Russians are reaching this stage where they're saying enough is enough. If you continue down this road and threaten us and then attack our territory and our people, we reserve the right to respond to you on your territory. And that's what people need to understand. It's a very dangerous red line to cross.
Colonel, I came across a phrase the other day with which I was unfamiliar, and I wonder if you know what it is. Glide bombs that the Russians are using. What are these, smart bombs, or are they something different?
Well, you could call them smart because they've been altered with kits that allow them to be precise. And the way they're used is that aircraft fly up towards the target array, whatever is being chosen, and from some distance, it can be anywhere from several kilometers to 100 kilometers or more, and they launch these bombs on a trajectory. The bombs have fins and they have a precision guided system attached to them, and they find their way to the target. So these glide bombs are enormously destructive, of 500 pounds and above. And when we launch similar weapon systems, as we've seen in Gaza, they find their targets and are devastating. And those are being used against the Ukrainians. They've been used for some time, which is why the fixed fortifications, as much of an irritant as they are not an answer to the Russian operation, which is what the Ukrainians have done. They've defended these fortifications to the best of their ability, but they're fixed. And anything that is a fixed target can be targeted by these weapons and utterly destroyed. And that's what's happened.
Do we have these? Does the United States have these?
Yeah, absolutely. We do. Absolutely. They've simply gone, I think, a little further than we have and made larger numbers of bombs precise than we have. But that doesn't mean we couldn't do the same thing. But we do have precision guided systems attached to them. Normally we use smaller weapon systems like the small diameter bomb. But nevertheless, yes. And this is another reminder, and I'm glad you brought it up. There is nothing in our inventory which the Russians don't also have. That's what we need to understand, that the days of the monopoly on precision strike that we enjoyed for so many years are over.
Colonel, is NATO finished as a serious military force? They're celebrating the Swedish and Finnish membership. I don't know what carrot or stick they used on Viktor Orban to get him to, or Erdogan to get them to consent to this, but maybe that's just speculation. But from a military perspective, is Russia afraid of NATO?
No, not anymore. I don't see any evidence for it, although they do respect American military capabilities, particularly when it comes to precision strike. And they do worry about the possibility that we might use a nuclear weapon. They've made it very clear they will not use a nuclear weapon unless we attack them. And I think Biden has tried to backtrack and say something similar about not using a weapon against the Russians. But nevertheless, I think everyone is on edge about it. my great fear has always been that in some way or another, we would be forced into ignominious withdrawal. And to cover this, we would threaten the use of nuclear weapons. I hope we don't do that.
The New York Times came out with a puff piece about the CIA, which indicated there are 12 CIA bases in Ukraine, and they've been there since 2014. I mean, I can't imagine why the CIA would even want that out there, unless, as you said at the outset of this conversation, Colonel, they're getting ready to leave. Obviously, if they are there and they're telling the New York Times they're there, the Russians know they're there, and the Russians know everything that's going on there.
Well, we're the only ones that haven't known because our government doesn't want to tell us these things. But the Russians have known from the beginning. They knew about the biolabs as well, where there were very sinister experiments underway to try and find, I'm told, bioweapons that would attack Slavic people in Eastern Europe. Kind of incomprehensible to me and frightening for all the obvious reasons, but I'm told that went on. The Russians know, so why bother trying to hide it any longer? And as you say, yes, we're getting ready to disengage. We are simply going to pull out. It'll be quiet. There'll be no announcements. We will simply leave. Europeans know that. That's why they're afraid. That's why they're scared. They're going to look ridiculous to their electorates that have stupidly elected these people. And I think they fear a giant red wave of right-wing nationalist organizations taking over. And I think they will, because at last people are standing up and saying, we have to be concerned about the future of Germany, of France, of Great Britain. We can't harness ourselves permanently to this country called the United States, which is dangerous. I mean, I remember back in the 1970s, we were looking at Helmut Schmidt as the chancellor of Germany, and he routinely expressed his discomfort with the things we wanted to do because he thought we were, quote unquote, cowboys. Well, if you go back and look at us in those days, we were remarkably stable and balanced. Right now, it's amateur hour, and I think everybody's figured it out.
Switching gears, Colonel, is there, in your view, a breach between Joe Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu? And even if there is it going to change American policy one whit toward Israel?
No. I mean, again, the key assumption for Israeli operations is that whatever they do, we will support them, period. And he sees no evidence that that key assumption has been invalidated. It hasn't. It's true. And right now, we are prepared to do whatever they ask us to do. And he knows that he wields infinitely more power and influence over decisions on Capitol Hill and in the White House, frankly, than President Biden. Biden has already said, whatever I don't like about the Israelis and what they're doing, I will continue to support them with whatever they want. There's the evidence for Mr. Netanyahu's correctness in his thinking.
Isn't it absurd? I'm trying to think of the right word. So self-defeating that we should be funding this war and at the same time bemoaning its over-aggressive techniques and trying to get aid to the poor souls that managed to survive it. I guess you're telling me there is zero chance that Joe Biden will pick up the phone and say to Netanyahu, stop the slaughter tomorrow, or all the spare parts and all the ammunition and all the weapons will stop coming to you. That simply will not happen.
That's right. It's not going to happen under any circumstances. And I think Biden and others know that the American people, frankly, aren't terribly interested, but those who are have been systematically conditioned to view Arabs and Muslims very negatively. I mean, look, we've spent over 20 years in the region, and most people come back from the region with a negative view of the people that live there. Now, that's not surprising, given the hostilities that we created in those regions. But the point is, most Americans either don't care or they assume that the people that are on the receiving end are probably worthy of it. I don't see it that way, and I think there are large numbers of us that don't, but we don't matter. We're not in power. If you're not in power in Washington, you're irrelevant. You have no say. I think that's something the American people are figuring out, that they're simply not represented. But it's not going to change this reality. I think the larger question is not for us at this stage, because we're going to do what we're going to do. I think the larger question is for the people that live in the region. What are the governments in the region going to do? And I think that after Ramadan, we'll begin to see a new viewpoint emerge. And I think the coalition of powers that are willing to finally do something, but not until after Ramadan ends. And I think Ramadan ends about the 9th or the 10th of April.
Colonel, what do you mean by a coalition of powers that are willing to do something? Do you mean state actors that might restrain the IDF slaughter?
Yes, I think you're going to see something that we haven't seen in the region for a long time. We've always been accustomed to dealing with non-state actors, and we will continue to see them play a role. And given the fact that Mr. Netanyahu will escalate, he will go into Rafah. There's no question about it. He sees that as unavoidably necessary to eradicate the population once and for all. And then secondly, he's going to go up against Hezbollah. And he wants to do that while he has control of us. Because if he gets into a fight with Hezbollah, he's going to need support from us. Hezbollah is no pushover. It's no Hamas by any stretch of the imagination. He knows that. As these things develop and occur, you're going to see a change in the Peninsular Arabs, a change among the Turks. And I think the Iranians, who really desperately want to stay out of this, will feel compelled to act in some sort of alignment with Hezbollah. They're not going to stand by and watch it destroyed. Then you have the problems in Egypt and Jordan. The question that Mr. Erdogan has to deal with is his population is enraged. They want to become involved. They want to stop the slaughter. What are they going to do when things fall apart in Egypt and Jordan, which they will? I can't say with absolute certainty, but I see these things as coalescing into some sort of arrangement that will be directed against the Israelis. The question at that point is, what do? We are the stalwart allies and supporters of Israel. Do we allow ourselves to be dragged into this? And you have a lot of people with their itchy trigger fingers when it comes to Iran. And there are increasingly many who would be equally aggressive towards the Turks. So I think the opportunity for a wider regional war is quite real.
Just to sort of break the ice a little bit from the seriousness of our conversation, here's President Biden over the weekend on MSNBC with an absurd interview about, does he have a red line with Prime Minister Netanyahu or doesn't he? Cut number 6, Sonia.
What is your red line with Prime Minister Netanyahu? Do you have a red line? For instance, would invasion of Rafah, which you have urged him not to do, would that be a red line?
It is a red line, but I'm never going to leave Israel. The defense of Israel is still critical. So there's no red line. I'm going to cut off all weapons so they don't have the Iron Dome to protect them. They don't have. But there's red lines that if he crosses, and he cannot have 30,000 more Palestinians dead.
I guess it's hard to figure out what he's talking about. Can Bibi go up to another 25,000? I don't want to sound sarcastic or supercilious. We're talking about innocent human lives here. I don't know if the president even knows what he means by a red line. A red line is usually a trigger. You go over that trigger and there's some serious pushback.
No, he's in Mr. Netanyahu's pocket. So he's not going to do anything. He said, I'm not going to abandon Israel. I will always help Israel to defend itself. Well, I think most of us agree with that. I always have. But a campaign of mass murder and expulsion that relies on everything from starvation and disease to smart bombs to be successful is hardly an exercise in defense. And an attack on Hezbollah would be equally offensive and not defensive at this stage. So, I just don't think he's thinking any of it through, and I don't think anybody's going to help him do so.
Here he is. I think you saw this, but I'll play it anyway. Walking out of the House of Representative chamber after that State of the Union. I don't know if he knew the microphone was on him or not. These hot mic incidents, I sometimes think, are setups, but whatever. He uses the phrase, come to Jesus. And he's going to have a come to Jesus with Netanyahu. You can't make this up.
Yeah.
And then one of his aides comes by and says, sir, you got a microphone on. Anyway, we'll watch this one. It's also somewhat amusing. It's not easy to hear. He appears to be talking to Senator Michael Bennet of Colorado and Secretary of State Blinken. Sonia, cut number 2.
This is one of the big
Great speech. Really nice. I was telling your secretary, I was in Jordan and Israel this weekend, and just, you got to keep pushing what you're doing on the humanitarian stuff and all this stuff. So,
I told him, baby, I'm gonna do this. I said, baby, you know I'm gonna come to Jesus.
sir, just
That might go good. That was good.
That was ridiculous.
Well, obviously, Mr. Netanyahu is never going to come to Jesus under any circumstances, and probably,
however you mean that.
yeah, and feels nothing but contempt for that. But I don't know what Mr. Biden thought he was doing. I mean, this business of bombing in the morning and passing out sandwiches and coffee in the afternoon is not a new development in the history of the United States. We have a bad habit of killing large numbers of people and then apologizing for it privately later, never publicly, and trying to compensate. This is part of the larger sort of incompetence and amateurishness that characterizes the leadership of our country. Perhaps they think Americans are all stupid. They're wrong. Americans are not stupid. And they do understand exactly what he's trying to do. He's trying to conceal reality by making statements designed to mollify the audience. It's not going to happen. And the sad part is that within another 2 weeks, there will be thousands of people in Gaza who are dead. And once they go into Rafah, there will be still more thousands dead. That is completely consistent with what the Israelis want. They've decided that's the only solution that works for them. We are the ones that are, what's the right word, Judge? Facilitating it, enabling it.